20-year-old Irina Yarmolenko was a sophomore finishing up finals during her last semester at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. The following fall, she was planning to transfer to UNC Chapel Hill, where she would pursue a career in public health. A bright woman with an active lifestyle, Irina was loved and supported by a large group of friends and a caring family. Tragically, Irina would never make it to her junior year at Chapel Hill. On May 5th, 2008, a pair of jet skiers going down the Catawba River near Mount Holly, North Carolina, made the grisly discovery of Irina's body. Her vehicle had smashed into a tree stump, and Irina lay near the river with 3 ligatures secured around her neck. Both individuals rushed to contact authorities who, upon arriving at the scene, found the young woman deceased. Investigators were baffled by the crime and who may have been responsible for it. For months, law enforcement conducted their investigation, but were unable to make any real connections. 2 suspects were continually called in for questioning, during which time each volunteered to submit their DNA, as well as offering to take polygraph tests. The suspects were Neil Cassada and Mark Carver. One polygraph was given and passed. The other was never administered. In October, Cassada and Carver were both charged with conspiracy and murder after the state found their DNA in mixtures taken from touch DNA samples. Trial dates wouldn't be set until nearly 2 years later. The day before Cassada's first appearance in court, he passed away due to complications from a heart condition. Mark Carver's case went forward, and ultimately, Carver was found guilty of the crime. However, in the years since, many questions have been raised about Carver's guilt, and multiple inconsistencies related to the trial have been found. A complicated and tragic story, rife with contradictions, misreported evidence, and outright untruthful testimony, has turned this case into a bitter dispute about the veracity of touch DNA, eyewitness accounts, and investigative techniques, a battle currently being fought between the Office of the District Attorney and the defense team from the North Carolina Center on Actual Innocence. All the while, Irina's family are caught in the middle, and Mark Carver is serving a life sentence for a crime which many believe he did not commit. This is Trace Evidence, Episode 52, The Murder of Irina Yarmolenko. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. In today's episode, I examine the tragic death of Irina Yarmolenko. It's an incredibly sad case, with a lot of twists and turns. Before moving into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focusing on a different unsolved case each week. Subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcatcher. If you have questions, comments, or case suggestions, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at TraceEvPod, on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, or join the Facebook discussion group simply by searching for Trace Evidence. You can visit the website at trace-evidence.com for full episodes, transcripts, social media links, merchandise, and much more. Trace Evidence is also on Patreon, so if you'd like to support the show, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence, where you can get rewards such as stickers, pins, and commercial-free episodes. There's also a PayPal donation link on the website for those of you who don't wish to go through Patreon. This show is a complete one-man operation, and your support is greatly appreciated. Trace Evidence is now a part of the Murderly Podcast Network. Visit murder.ly for more information and many other amazing true crime podcasts. Today I examine the death of Irina Yarmolenko. This is a local case for me, having occurred not very far from where I live. It's an extremely complicated case, and it's a little different from my usual episodes. In this case, someone is currently serving time for this crime, but there is a wealth of evidence which calls that into question. Just wanted to note before beginning, this is a controversial story, and there are families whose emotions are tied into both sides of this story. It is not my intent to tear open old wounds or to argue innocence or guilt. It is, as always, my goal to discuss the facts of the case as they are known. As Voltaire famously wrote, "To the living we owe respect, but to the dead we owe only truth." This is episode 52, The Murder of Irina Yarmolenko. Irina Sergeyevna Yarmolenko was born on May 2, 1988 in Ukraine, to Sergey and Yelena Yarmolenko. Irina was often referred to as Ira, and that is how I will refer to her throughout this episode. Details about the Yarmolenko family's time in Ukraine is in little detail, and ultimately, Ira would immigrate to the United States with her parents and brother, Pavel, 5 years older than her. Their journey to the United States happened when Ira was just 8 years old, with the Yarmolenkos arriving in North Carolina in 1996. Initially, the family settled in Greensboro. They immigrated under refugee status, escaping from what Pavel has described as religious persecution in their homeland of Ukraine. Ira's parents took jobs as scientists in Greensboro, though ultimately the family would move one final time, settling in Carborough, North Carolina, with a Chapel Hill mailing address. Carborough sits directly west of Chapel Hill, with their city centers being less than 2 miles apart, and the cities are often thought of as being entangled. Residents frequently spend time in each area, with Carborough being the smaller of the two, boasting a population of just over 20,000. Chapel Hill sits in both Orange and Durham counties, covering 21.3 square miles. When the Yarmolenko family moved in, during the mid-1990s, the population was approximately 40,000, though 10 years later, it will have risen to nearly 50,000. Chapel Hill is North Carolina's 15th largest city by population, and is home to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as the UNC Healthcare, a not-for-profit medical system owned by the state. Chapel Hill, along with Durham and Raleigh, make up 3 points of what is often referred to as the Research Triangle, made up by major research centers UNC Chapel Hill, UNC Raleigh, and Duke University. Upon arriving in the area, Ira spoke Russian, though according to an interview with her brother, within months of living in the States, Ira had begun speaking English with a distinct Southern accent. Ira was a brilliant and talented young woman, and her intelligence was recognized at an early age. She was a conglomeration of influences, exploring the world both within and outside of the realm of scholastics. While she was an avid reader and skilled student, she also had a passion for the outdoors. Pavel would later say of Ira, quote, "She really enjoyed the beauty of nature. She tried to find it everywhere." End quote. Some of Ira's favorite activities included hiking, tennis, and basketball. When she wasn't out exploring the beauty of the nature around her, for which she felt an innate compulsion, she could often be found writing poetry, playing piano, and listening to her favorite band, the Counting Crows. Ira would be part of a poetry group, then known as the Chapel Hill Slam Team, though following her death, their name was changed to the Sacrificial Poets, in honor of her memory. A sample of one of Ira's poems reads, "In words, poets find solitude. Even if nothing is good, it can be written as if it is. That's what I love about poets. Unmaterialistic intellect, the control and power of something that is dead before they take hold of it." Ira's academic interests were varied. Though she excelled at math and in the sciences, she was also fascinated and curious about journalism and photography. In 2006, she would graduate from Chapel Hill High School and go on to the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. During her time at UNC Charlotte, Ira bounced through several different areas of interest while expanding on her extracurricular activities. Her major was undeclared, though friend Megan Sorensen explained that Ira was pursuing French as a frontrunner at that time. During the spring of 2007, Ira worked as a server at the Paul J. Rizzo Conference Center at Meadowmont in Chapel Hill. She traveled that summer with the parent company, going to Alaska where she would work as a waitress at the restaurant at McKinley Village Lodge in Denali National Park. Ira was accompanied by her boyfriend at the time and a few friends. Members of the lodge and former co-workers commented on Ira's beauty and grace, and made mention of how kind and loving she was. While at UNC Charlotte, Ira worked as a helper in the campus computer center, did photography work for the school's newspaper, the University Times, and was a writer for the online paper known as the Niner Online. She also had a flair for the dramatic, with an interest in acting and theater. Megan Sorensen described Ira as a talented actress and stated that she had worked on a play with her in the past. Beyond that, Sorensen raved about Ira's personality, specifying that she just had a magic way about her where she could make anyone she was talking to feel like they were the most important person in the world. Beyond her interest in acting, Ira also maintained a grasp on her roots, being a member of the UNC Charlotte Russian Club. By her sophomore semester at UNC Charlotte, beginning in the fall of 2007, Ira was beginning to consider more options for her future, and discussion came up about a possible transfer. It's been stated that Ira was the kind of person who always wanted to help others, and perhaps in pursuit of that desire, she began looking at setting a major in public health. While this was something she was deeply passionate about, she wasn't necessarily wishing to do so at the Charlotte campus, and so Ira decided that after completion of her sophomore year, in the spring of 2008, she would transfer to UNC Chapel Hill. During Ira's college years, she'd been involved in a relationship with a fellow student, which would last for a total of 3 years, ending just a few weeks prior to May of 2008. Speculation is rampant about the details of this relationship's ending, with some arguing that it was a mutual decision, while others have suggested that Ira's boyfriend broke up with her after an incident of infidelity. There's been a lot of debate about Ira's sexuality. While some friends have said that the beautiful young woman was openly bisexual, and others have said that if she was, she kept it quiet. I've read multiple articles suggesting that Ira was the president of her high school's gay-straight alliance, and while some have pointed to this as certification that she was indeed bisexual, the organization revolves around bringing together the LGBT community and heterosexuals in order to promote acceptance and understanding. The relevance, or lack thereof, of Ira's sexuality in relation to her murder is important depending upon your perspective of what exactly took place. It changes suspect lists. It opens or closes certain possibilities about people in her world who may have potentially had reason to want to strike out against her, or those with an ignorant bias against a bisexual woman. In forum discussions, one piece of Ira's poetry has been quoted frequently as suggesting her bisexuality, or at least confusion about her sexual status, and reads as follows, quote, "Skinny celebrities, sexuality, confused a moment," end quote. However, while this may be compelling, as a poet myself, it's not uncommon for the voice of a poem to not always be that of the author solely. In several articles, Ira was described by fellow students as someone interested in social justice, who fought for equal rights and fair treatment for all across the board, regardless of gender or sexuality. Whatever Ira's standing in terms of her sexuality, it's a mystery of this case which may or may not carry importance, depending upon your view. Either way, it seems quite clear that Ira was opposed to anyone being mistreated, regardless of who they were, and she was devoted to a fight for equality. A friend of Ira's boyfriend later alleged that despite their breakup, the former boyfriend had expressed an interest in trying to reconnect with her over the summer in an attempt to work things out. On May 2, 2008, Ira was surprised by a group of friends and her roommates from the Hunt Village apartments near campus who threw her a 20th birthday celebration. As was Ira's style and personality, even at her own party, she couldn't simply sit back and enjoy the festivities without pitching in. Multiple friends who attended the party have said that Ira got up and began cooking, ultimately preparing food for all the attendees. The party was, in a way, multifaceted, as Ira was not only turning 20, but would be moving on to UNC Chapel Hill for her junior semester. For some, it was remembered as bittersweet, and Pavel, in a later interview, stated, quote, "She was not sure how she felt about leaving Charlotte, but she was very, very excited about coming to Chapel Hill." End quote. Sadly, Ira would never make it to Chapel Hill, nor her junior year of college. The potential burning inside of this vibrant and talented 20-year-old would be extinguished in a senseless act of violence which, to this day, baffles some and exists as the calling card of a convicted killer for others. There's a lot of confusion following the crime itself, but the timeline leading up to the murder taking place has been fairly firmly established. In hopes of exploring more in depth, I'm going to follow the official timeline closely here to show Ira's movements in the days leading up to her murder. Ira's birthday took place on Friday, May 2, 2008. The party appears to have been thrown on the campus of UNC Charlotte, and following the festivities, Ira accompanied multiple friends to an art gallery in northern Davidson County before returning to campus and ending the night. By all accounts, the night ended with everyone in good spirits and Ira being her usual jovial self. On Sunday, May 4th, a Russian-language classmate of Ira's ran into her at the campus library. He later wrote in a memorial post about her, quote, "I was pleasantly surprised to see her and began conversing with her in Russian about her recent birthday and birthday party that her roommates and friends had thrown her, about her roommate Masha, her plans for the summer, etc. We would talk here and there before she finally got up to leave, with one final hug and said bye in Russian. She smiled at me and said, 'Talk to you again soon, have a good day,' and like that, she was gone from me." End quote. On Monday, May 5th, Ira was spotted at her Hunt Village apartment on the south side of campus. It was a week of finals at UNC Charlotte, and Ira attended and took a final exam, last being seen on campus at approximately 9:45 a.m. She had another exam scheduled for 5 p.m. Surveillance camera footage and financial records show that between 10:17 and 10:21 a.m., Ira stopped inside the State Employees Credit Union on University Boulevard near campus, where she deposited some checks. A cash transaction was made, though it hasn't been confirmed whether Ira was depositing or withdrawing cash at this time. Some articles have specified that Ira made a small deposit, and others have said it was a small withdrawal. The credit union was unable to confirm either of these details in a later trial. At 10:33 a.m., Ira arrived at a Goodwill store also located on University Boulevard. Police later clocked the drive from the credit union to the Goodwill store as taking approximately 5 minutes and 50 seconds, which adds some leeway time as it took Ira 12 minutes to make the same trip. Authorities have, at different points in time, specified that they believe Ira made additional stops this day, but the timeline exists based purely upon security camera footage, and there was not cameras in all the other locations. On the video footage from the Goodwill, a male employee approaches Ira's vehicle as she exits. The Goodwill has an outside donation bin which is monitored, and so when the employee approached, Ira handed him some bags and she carried others. In total, 6 bags filled with her personal belongings were given to the Goodwill store. Among the items donated were a backpack and a trash bag filled with soft items believed to have been articles of clothing. Ira also attempted to donate pillows at this time, but the Goodwill store didn't accept pillow donations, and so she put them back in her car on the surveillance footage. Between 10:33 and 10:50 a.m., Ira was spotted at Jackson's Java, a coffee shop where she'd been working since the previous August. Ira had recently resigned since she was going to be moving away. Coworkers have said that it wasn't uncommon for Ira to stop by on days off simply to socialize and hang out. The exact timing of her arrival at the shop is estimated based on the statements of coworkers who reported seeing her that morning. Ira is reported to have dropped off some gifts for her former coworkers that morning and to have lightly discussed her upcoming move to Chapel Hill. At 11:09 a.m., Ira's car was last seen via a surveillance camera at the Stowe Family YMCA in Belmont, west of the Catawba River. Video quality was poor, making it difficult for investigators to determine how many people were in the vehicle and whether or not it was Ira herself driving. Police later drove from Jackson's Java to the YMCA, alleging that it would have taken Ira only 19 minutes, which they later stated would have placed Ira arriving exactly when the surveillance footage shows her vehicle. But this detail has been disputed, with others saying that the drive from Jackson's Java to the YMCA would have taken a minimum of 30 minutes and possibly as long as 45. It's interesting to note that, at the time, 3 sources indicated that Ira had an ex-boyfriend who worked at the YMCA, and that she may have stopped there to see him. These accounts are speculative, though investigators did later state that they interviewed the ex and he had been out of state at the time, which they verified through airline tickets. While Ira's ultimate destination is known, the method by which she traveled there following her visit to the YMCA has also been debated. Investigators have stated that they believe Ira turned right after exiting the parking lot, heading down a dirt road through the Water's Edge subdivision construction area, driving towards the Catawba River. Others have reported accounts of Ira driving to a Wendy's fast food restaurant and then a Citgo gas station, though these accounts have never been verified. It is interesting to note that a Wendy's bag was found in Ira's trunk. At approximately 12:40 p.m., an hour and a half after Ira's vehicle was captured on security footage at the YMCA, Dennis Lovelace and Brenda Pierce began jet skiing along the Catawba River. The two entered the river at Dale's Supret on Wilkinson Boulevard and began traveling north via the river. Their 2 accounts of the events have conflicted, with Dennis recounting that as they were going up the river, they spotted Ira's vehicle on the riverbank and immediately proceeded toward it. Brenda Pierce, however, has stated that the two noticed the vehicle and continued up the river a ways before stopping to check the jet ski plugs. At this time, they turned around and began heading south, and as they passed Ira's car this time, they noted that it appeared to have crashed into a tree stump. It was at this time that they noticed a body lying on the ground just a few feet away from the car. According to Brenda, they'd been on the water approximately 10 to 15 minutes at this time, making it somewhere between 12:50 and 12:55. However, by Dennis's story, they'd been on the river approximately 5 minutes, which would have made it 12:45. Both Dennis and Brenda agree that upon spotting the body, they split up and went in separate directions in order to call for help. Dennis later stated, quote, "I told Brenda to go call 911. Brenda went back towards Dale's boat landing to call. I rode my jet ski to a construction site and told the workers to call 911 because there was a dead body. I then went back to where the body was. I stayed on the scene until a police officer said I could leave." End quote. Brenda, on the other hand, rode her jet ski approximately 10 minutes downriver and called 911 herself. I'll now play a snippet of Brenda's 911 call.
County 911. I'm a boater on the Catawba River. Above the I-85 bridge. There's a car that's run off an embankment and there's a body laying there. I don't know if they're alive or not.
The two timelines differ, involving Brenda stating that they returned to the body on the second pass versus Dennis saying that they went to it the first time, creates a discrepancy. Brenda's call was received by the Belmont Police Department at 1:18 p.m., meaning that if Dennis is correct, it took approximately from 12:45 to 1:18, over 30 minutes, to call police, whereas if Brenda's account is accurate, it took approximately 23 minutes. Investigators felt that Brenda's account for the timeline was the more accurate of the two. The Belmont Police Department received the call at 1:18, and while dispatching officers, they also contacted the Mount Holly Police Department. The area in which the vehicle and body were discovered ultimately fell under the jurisdiction of Mount Holly, but all call ranges in the area varied, which is why the call came into the Belmont Police. Both departments responded with officers arriving at nearly the same time, though the Belmont Police would work to assist the Mount Holly officers as it was their investigation based on the location. Their arrival is set at approximately 2 p.m. Shortly after setting foot on the scene, a crime scene investigator from the Gaston County Police Department also arrived, as well as members of a rescue team attached to the fire department. When investigators arrived on the scene, the first thing they noticed was Ira's blue Saturn sedan. The vehicle had crashed into a tree stump not far from the edge of the river. Both doors on the driver's side were left open. From their view, the vehicle appeared to have not been traveling very fast, and the collision had not caused the airbags to deploy. Dirt appeared to have been kicked up under the tires, leading Mount Holly Police Chief David Belk to later suggest that the vehicle had been put in reverse following the crash. Belk later stated, quote, "We can say that the vehicle was running at the edge of the water." End quote. However, conflicting information has also been presented, suggesting that the vehicle had been running after impact and that it was in gear, implying that the car hadn't stopped immediately at the time of the crash, and this may have resulted in the dirt getting kicked up. Investigators would later state that the vehicle had been found in neutral, which has also stirred up controversy as the keys were not in the ignition. It has been pointed out that the 1998 Saturn was a General Motors vehicle, which operated under the BTSI system, standing for brake, transmission, shift, interlock system, which means that in order to remove the key from the ignition, the car must be placed in park. In addition to this, the shifter cannot be moved into the neutral position without inserting the key, starting the car, applying the brake, and then shifting into neutral, which adds a lot of controversy to the actual gear in which the car was found. Ira's keys were found on the ground near her body, and investigators noted that mud had been smeared on the window of the rear driver's side door. The grass around the driver's side door has been reported to have been flattened out, suggesting a struggle may have occurred there, though even this point is debated as to whether it was flattened out before or after investigators arrived. The hood of the car had sustained damage from the accident. There were several items inside the vehicle, including the pillows Ira had attempted to donate earlier that day, and a flowered tote bag, from which one of the blue ribbon straps had been torn off. Lying beside the car, just a few feet away from the driver's door, was Ira. She was found in tall weeds and grass. A circle having a diameter of approximately 6 to 8 feet was knocked down and flattened around her, implying that a struggle had taken place. She was dressed in a black UNC Pembroke hooded sweater, a black skirt, and brown athletic shoes. Ira's hair, skin, and clothing were wet. It should be noted that some articles have stated that her clothing was dry while her hair and body were wet, but it appears as though everything was wet from police reports. The earth around her was dry. Ira's head was back towards the embankment, her feet closer to the river under some brush. One of her hands was tightly grasping a reed nearby, which is believed to have been the result of a cadaveric spasm. A cadaveric spasm is an instantaneous rigidity like rigor mortis, but it occurs at the moment of death and is actually stronger and stiffer than rigor. This implies that the position Ira was found in was the exact position she had been in at the moment of her death. The cause of her death was quickly noted. There were 3 ligatures around her neck, fashioned out of random items. Ira was wearing a hooded sweater, and the string from the hood had been removed and wrapped around her neck, once completely around, and the second loop only went halfway. The drawstring was knotted several times on the right side of her neck. A bungee cord was also found around her neck, crossing over the front of her throat and hooked in the back. Finally, a nylon blue ribbon was wrapped once around her neck and tied with a bow in the front. Later investigation discovered the blue ribbon was actually taken from the tote bag in Ira's car, and fibers found on her keys suggested that whoever had used the ribbon actually sawed it off the bag using her own car keys. Also, it was later determined that the ribbon was tied on first, followed by the drawstring, and finally the bungee cord. It was a deeply disturbing scene, and the multiple items used confused investigators. Were a perpetrator attempting to strangle Ira, just one of these items would have been employed and could have successfully gotten the job done. The use of all 3 will lead to many questions later in the investigation. There was some blood found at the scene, though it was all Ira's. It is believed to have come from her nose as a result of the strangulation. There was also some signs of petechia on Ira's right thigh, indicating that something had impacted her there. While investigators examined the area, bizarrely, they found no footprints near Ira nor at the riverbank, not even her own footprints. A medical examiner never came to the scene and examined Ira's remains later and was able to view photographs of the scene only. In North Carolina, state law does not require the medical examiner to come to the scene of the crime, and in most instances, the examiners elect not to do so. Further examination of Ira, her car, and the scene produced little to assist in determining who may have been responsible and what may have occurred. Ira's car interior showed no signs of a struggle. When her trunk was opened, investigators found various items, including a bag from a Wendy's fast food restaurant and a camera. The 35mm camera was advanced to exposures, but there was no film inside. At the time, investigators were poring over the scene. There's been a lot of debate about how the scene itself was handled. Media quickly picked up on the story, and helicopters arrived, filming down on the investigation. During these videos, played later on local stations, multiple officers can be seen processing the scene without gloves on, touching the vehicle and items surrounding the scene. Investigators began looking around the area for potential witnesses. The jet skiers were questioned, though they were unable to provide any information about what may have happened. Construction workers operating nearby were also questioned, but they too failed to have seen or heard anything. Police eventually came upon Mark Carver, located approximately 100 yards away from the scene of the crime. Carver had previously been spending time with his cousin, Neil Cassada, but Neil had left shortly before police had arrived at the location. Investigators would later speak to Cassida as well. When investigators came upon Carver, they found him sitting on the tailgate of his SUV and fishing in the Catawba River. Carver was asked whether or not he'd heard or seen anything, and he told investigators that he'd heard a scraping sound, which he assumed was related to the nearby construction, but may have actually been in relation to Ira's vehicle on the tree stump. He didn't hear any screams for help or sounds of a struggle. Carver was asked for identification and provided investigators with his fishing license. One thing which is interesting to note is while Carver and the construction workers didn't hear anything in relation to the crime, they all stated that they heard the jet skiers calling for help. According to Carver, he and his cousin Neil Cassida had arrived at the river at approximately 11:30 that morning, about an hour and a half before Ira's body was found. Cassida is alleged to have left 30 minutes later, around 12 p.m., having only stopped by to pick up a salt block for his goats, which was in Carver's possession. After noting his name and address, the officer returned the license to Carver, shook his hand, and went back to the scene. Carver left his fishing location at 2:30 p.m. to go and pick up his daughters from school. He returned to the river later that day, hoping to retrieve some fishing nets which he'd left behind, but authorities wouldn't allow him access to the river area at that time. Rumors began to build up before Ira's body had even been removed from the scene. Todd Cloyd, who lived nearby and was working on his home that afternoon, heard the jet skiers calling for help. He eventually grabbed a canoe and rowed over toward the scene of the crime, curious as to what was happening. Cloyd later claimed that, upon arriving, he engaged a fellow boater in conversation, and the man had told him that first responders had stated it looked like a suicide. This statement is highly speculative, but news articles would later report that Ira's brother, Pavel, had heard rumors from investigators about suicide being a possibility. The suicide theory is a highly controversial avenue in regard to this case and has supporters and detractors on all sides. Ira's family was firmly against this theory, saying that Ira was very happy and was looking forward to attending UNC Chapel Hill. She was uplifted about her future possibilities and at no point displayed any signs of depression. There have been, though, statements made by others which appear to contradict this. Much of this information is very speculative, but is important in line with this theory. Firstly, 5 people associated with the investigation have alleged, through confidentiality, that the term suicide appeared in Ira's phone's internet search history. Several friends of Ira's from high school also made allegations that Ira had attempted suicide before and had been hospitalized for hurting herself. It's also been suggested that, upon transferring to Chapel Hill, Ira would have moved back in with her parents, and it's been alleged by a college friend that Ira stated she would kill herself if she had to live under the rules again. This is also highly speculative, and those who have made these statements have elected not to have their names listed, but they are interesting details to note. Some who have investigated this case believe even the location of Ira's car suggests suicide, as it's possible she may have driven toward the river with the intent of submerging into it, but hit the stump which stopped her. I'll touch back on this theory later. What is known for certain is that Ira was unsure how she felt about leaving UNC Charlotte, and in the hours leading up to her death, donated a great amount of her personal effects. For many, this is an indication that she may have not been in a good state of mind and could be significant in terms of a suicide possibility. For others, it was simply the act of a young woman clearing away clutter, knowing that she would be moving away from the area. While suicide has been debated, the medical examiner would ultimately disagree. Pathologist Chris Wynn conducted the autopsy the following day at Gaston Memorial Hospital. The cause of death was ruled to be asphyxia secondary to ligature strangulation. Dr. Wynn determined that Ira could not have tied the ligatures herself, and argued that she would have lost consciousness within seconds of applying the first. It's important to note that Wynn shifts the order of the ligatures, stating that the drawstring was applied first, followed by the blue ribbon, and finally the bungee cord. This is in contradiction to Mount Holly police investigator William Terry, who cited the order as being the blue ribbon, the drawstring, and finally the bungee cord. Officer Terry had been on the scene that day, while Wynn used photographs from the scene and also felt that the ligatures may have shifted when Ira's remains were being transported. In terms of the possibility of suicide, Dr. Wynn's statements show that she would have passed out if she'd attempted to tie the ligatures herself, though there is some debate about this as well. At trial, prosecutors will later argue that Ira would not have been able to wrap the bungee cord around her neck and secure the hooks behind her head in time. But at least one group has conducted a reenactment, during which time an actor was able to secure all 3 ligatures and hook the bungee cord behind her own neck. Of course, being that it was a reenactment, it's unlikely that the actress risked her own life by securing the ligatures as tightly. The suicide theory follows the thought process that Ira may have first attempted to drive her car into the river, and upon hitting the stump, the impact may have driven her thigh into the steering wheel, causing the previously mentioned petechia. It is then argued that Ira, having been unsuccessful, may have thrown herself into the river in an attempt to drown, which would explain why she was wet, but that she was unable to hold herself under the water. Following this, it is suggested that Ira may have secured the ligatures herself. However, this exists only in theory, as Dr. Wynn was firmly opposed to it. Wynn's beliefs were, in part, based on deprivation of blood flow to and from the head due to the tightness of the ligatures around Ira's neck. He noted finding multiple small pinpoint hemorrhages on both eyes, involving the whites of the eyes, the sclera, and the conjunctiva. Wynn later stated, quote, "Whenever ligatures are applied, or pressure is applied to your neck, it closes off the vascular or blood flow to your head, and that blood cannot get out of your head, and pressure builds up in your head, and so small capillaries tend to burst, and when they burst, they drop a small drop of blood into the soft tissue, and that is what you are seeing there, and they are called petechia." End quote. Wynn also stated that there was no sign that Ira had been sexually assaulted, and investigators found no sign of robbery, leading them to wonder what the motive to this awful crime could possibly be. Ira's vehicle was driven by a police officer to an impound for further investigation, though the car would not be swabbed for DNA evidence for 2 months after the murder took place. The reason? Allegedly, police simply lost track of time and evidence and weren't aware that it hadn't been done yet. In the immediate aftermath of their discovery, several hours later, around 5 p.m., an officer arrived at the Yarmolenko home to inform them of Ira's death. It was devastating news. The family questioned how they could be sure, and the officer explained that they had confirmed Ira's identity. Pavel would later say, quote, "I think all of us simply collapsed where we were." End quote. Wanting to know what happened, the family asked questions, but investigators were short on answers. They didn't have a suspect or a motive, but their investigation was going to be their top priority. Unfortunately for the family and investigators, answers would be much more difficult to find than they'd imagined. Their first act was to speak with friends, teachers, and associates at UNC Charlotte. They were attempting to determine why Ira would have been at such a remote spot on that day, and how she knew about the location in the first place. Their initial theory was that Ira may not have come to the river alone that day. Their theory follows 2 possibilities: that Ira may have been in the company of a friend or acquaintance that day, or that she may have run into trouble while running her errands and had been abducted. Among those questioned were Ira's roommates, friends, ex-boyfriends, and co-workers, though none were able to provide information about anyone who may have wished to harm Ira, and all were able to provide alibis. Ultimately, Ira's reason for being near the Catawba River that day is believed to have been for photography. According to a photographer for UNC Charlotte's newspaper, Ira had stated a week prior to her death that she wanted to photograph people kayaking and rafting at the Whitewater Center, located upriver from the spot where she was found. When her family was asked about the location, they were unfamiliar with it, though Pavel did say that Ira loved the outdoors and was adventurous, often finding little-known places that you couldn't get to by normal roads. It seemed as though, whether the reason was photography or simply looking for a quiet spot to enjoy nature, Ira had come upon someone with sinister intentions. Who that could be, though, continued to baffle investigators. Ira's family worked hard to get as much attention on the case as they could. Pavel became a spokesman for the family, taking part in interviews with local media, as well as producing thousands of flyers which he and others would plaster all over town. The flyers bore Ira's photo and asked for information related to her death. The flyers were put up all over Mount Holly, as well as Chapel Hill and Charlotte. UNC Charlotte offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of Ira's killer. At the time, Pavel was a graduate student at Duke University. When asked about the search for his sister's killer, he responded, quote, "It was just a constant search to find out who it was. In the beginning, we were asking questions about why somebody would do it. But that question stopped making any sense. We just needed to find the bastards who did it. We were tormented by the search. We thought of it, more or less, constantly." End quote. On Friday and Saturday, May 9th and 10th, a candlelight memorial was held for Ira at Belk Tower on the campus of UNC Charlotte, during which time Pavel eulogized his sister and called upon all attendees to make sure their families and friends knew they were loved, and to not waste a moment of time in making sure those you care about know how you feel. The funeral was held on Saturday, May 10th, at 4 p.m. at Chapel Hill Memorial Cemetery. Another memorial was held on Saturday, May 17th, in the Haynes Auditorium at Chapel Hill High School. The Yarmolenko family set up an Irina Yarmolenko Memorial Fund. A few weeks after Ira's murder, her former job at Jackson's Java held an informal memorial. The media was present for the event, and the coffee shop continues to keep a photograph of Ira on the counter. On August 2nd, 2008, the Realistic Female Self-Defense Company organized an Irina Yarmolenko Memorial Violence Prevention Training event at the Carborough Century Center. A year later, in June of 2009, they held a celebration of life event in Ira's memory. On June 10th, 2014, UNC Charlotte's College of Arts and Architecture established the Irina Yarmolenko Memorial Scholarship. The site of Ira's death is marked by a memorial cross, which was put into place by Dennis Lovelace and Brenda Pierce, the two jet skiers who had discovered her body. Due to the rising and falling nature of the Catawba River, at some times of the year the cross is fully in view, and other times the water level is more than a foot above the cross. Ira's former place of work, during her time in Alaska, McKinley Village Lodge, requested a memorial be erected to Ira. Kansas City-based artist Shane Blint designed and installed a bench with a plaque and Ira's name written out in a sweeping and eye-catching script. For the Yarmolenko family, laying Ira to rest was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey to find and deliver justice to the person or persons responsible. Towards the end of June, well over a month after Ira's murder, Pavel issued a public statement addressing the killer, saying, quote, "I have no doubt that once you truly realize how deeply you've hurt us all, you'll have no choice but to surrender. If you have anything human left in you, you owe us something. Here is the least of what we want: an apology. If you face up to justice, my family will actually be thankful to you for something. Consider that." End quote. Months began passing, with little new information discovered. Investigators rolled through a list of potential suspects alleged to have been approximately 8 people. In each instance, potential suspects were questioned and ultimately rejected as possibilities. Some had airtight alibis, others, police felt, simply didn't seem to have knowledge of details of the crime, nor the Constitution to commit this heinous act. There were, however, 2 names that investigators continued turning back to: Mark Carver and Neil Cassida, the 2 men who had been fishing 100 yards away during the time that whatever happened to Ira had taken place. Police had difficulty shaking the 2 men, and found it suspicious that they had been so close to the scene, but claimed to have heard nothing. They then spoke with Carver and Cassida several times since the murder had taken place, and in each instance, both men denied being involved or hearing anything to indicate to them that a crime had taken place. Both Cassida and Carver voluntarily submitted DNA for processing by investigators. In addition to this, 5 months after the murder had taken place, Cassida took a polygraph and passed. Carver requested that he also be given a polygraph, but investigators elected not to grant his request. Both men appeared willing to cooperate and hopeful about clearing their names. While they understood investigators were trying to catch a killer, both began to get the impression that they were being looked at a little more thoroughly than had been implied early on. The police simply kept coming back with more and more questions. The DNA was an interesting angle, as investigators had very little to work with. There was no foreign DNA found at the scene, none on Ira's body, none on the ligatures. There was no blood or fluid present outside of blood from Ira's nose. Though at the time it wasn't released publicly, there was an unidentified DNA sample found under Ira's fingernails. To this day, that DNA has never been matched to anyone. Some details regarding the crime did begin to be released publicly. Mount Holly Police Chief David Belk explained that they'd examined Ira's car's black box and found that, at the time the vehicle had crashed, it was traveling 15 miles per hour, and later data confirmed someone had been sitting in the driver's seat with the safety belt secured. When asked about the progress on the case, Belk responded, quote, "We're doing quite well with the puzzle's outline. The middle design is the challenge." End quote. By the end of 2008, a new scientific method would provide investigators with a break in the case. During the course of the investigation, as it was being handled by the Mount Holly Police Department, the State Bureau of Investigation was utilized to provide assistance, much of which would come in their crime lab, which possessed far more advanced technologies and capabilities. Early in December of 2008, 7 months after Ira's murder, a forensic scientist working for the SBI contacted investigators and informed them that she had found matches related to DNA lifted from 3 locations on and inside of Ira's car. All 3 samples contained mixtures of different people's DNA. However, in one spot, the predominant profile appeared to belong to Mark Carver. In 2 other locations, it belonged to Neil Cassida. With this evidence in hand, investigators felt that their instincts about the 2 men had been correct all along. They now had DNA connecting their suspects to the crime scene, a scene which both men had, time and time again, explained that they'd never been to. One final conversation took place between Carver and investigators, during which time Carver was asked how his DNA could be found in Ira's car if he'd never been to the scene. Carver explains that there was no way his DNA could possibly have been found there. At one point, an SBI investigator asks, "Do you want to bet?" To which Carver responds, "I'll bet you $1 million." I will now play a clip from this interrogation, though I do warn you that the audio quality isn't great.
I found your DNA inside her car. How can you explain it?
Now you didn't find mine.
Oh yeah, I did. I did. How many yours and Neil's money?
My DNA ain't in that car.
How much money do you want to pay?
I bet you $1 million. My DNA ain't in that car. I didn't know that car was even up there.
Hey, mine.
I can't help it, but I didn't do it.
You said you didn't see a car, you never heard a car, you never touched a car. Lo and behold, guess whose DNA is inside a dead girl's car? Yours.
While Carver was allowed to leave following this line of questioning, a warrant was later obtained, and on December 11th, 2008, at 4:30 a.m., both Mark Carver and Neil Cassida were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy. That afternoon, Carver was interviewed by members of the media while being held in custody. During the course of the interview, Carver explained that it simply wasn't possible for his DNA to have been present at the crime scene. When asked if he had given his DNA to authorities, he replied that he had, doing so in order to prove his innocence. Carver was then asked if he believed Cassida may have committed the crime, to which he responded, quote, "I don't think Neil would do something like that. He's got 4 youngins himself." End quote. Carver was emotionally distraught and tearing up by the end of the interview, though he held firm to his innocence, repeating, quote, "I didn't do it." End quote. For Ira's family, they were happy to see that charges had been filed and that the men were going to face justice for what they'd done. For others, it became a question of who Mark Carver and Neil Cassida were and how they fit into this disturbing and heartbreaking story. Carver was a local, having grown up on family land in Gaston County. Just 5 miles from the Catawba River, 2 roads converge. Carver Drive, named after Mark's father's side of the family, and Nolan Street, named after his mother's. Carver lived with his father, and by all accounts, including his own, was an uneducated man. He grew up farming locally and never finished high school. He was placed in special education classes and dropped out when he was 16, electing to work in a nearby cotton mill. He has difficulty reading and cannot write, and has defined himself as illiterate. For most people who knew Carver, the word simple was frequently used to describe the uneducated man with an IQ of 60. In 2008, when Ira was murdered, Carver was 39 years old and a father to 4 children. His sister-in-law, Robin, when asked about Carver, stated, quote, "He lived for his family and children. He didn't really do much of anything else. Fishing and hunting and family, that was about it." End quote. Carver quit his job at the mill in the 1980s, according to him, as the result of carpal tunnel syndrome, which made it difficult, if not impossible, for him to continue working. Carver has had multiple surgeries related to his carpal tunnel since the 1980s, and complications from one of those surgeries left him disabled. Carver has a deficiency when it comes to his hands, giving him little to no grip. Doctor's orders instruct him not to lift anything weighing more than 5 pounds. In an interview with reporters from the television news program 2020, Carver unbuttoned his sleeve to show the surgery scars. When asked to rebutton his sleeve, Carver struggled for several minutes to push the small plastic button through the slot. Carver used to take his children fishing along the Catawba River when they were young, as it was his favorite pastime. Carver had fished all along the river, but had only recently discovered the spot he was in the day Ira died. The weekend prior to the attack, Carver had been in the same spot, along with his cousin Neil Cassida and Neil's wife Kay. Cassida was also a man with a family who enjoyed a simple life alongside Carver. The 2 men were close, and had been for a long time. They frequently fished together. Cassida and his wife Kay had 5 children, and lived approximately 10 minutes from the Catawba River. This was not the only similarity between Cassida and Carver, as Neil also had medical ailments impeding his abilities. Cassida suffered from heart disease, and according to friends and family, it was difficult for him to walk 50 feet without resting, as he would be short of breath and in many instances was aided if he had to walk for a longer period of time. Cassida had left his job at the mill, having suffered a heart attack at the age of 36. He was defined by many as a jack of all trades, having done brick masonry at different points in his life. In addition to fishing, he enjoyed gardening and had a green thumb. While both men appeared to be quiet, reserved, and polite, there were some details about their pasts which helped investigators focus in on them. In 1995, Cassida was accused of assault by pointing a gun, assault and battery, and injury to personal property. The charges were ultimately dismissed. 10 years later, in 2005, Carver was charged with injury to real property. According to a witness, Carver had followed two men who he believed had attempted to steal his four-wheeler. He fired a gun into the home the men had gone into. This charge was also dismissed. 2 years later, in 2007, just 1 year prior to Ira's murder, Carver was charged with shooting and wounding his own son. According to an interview with his son in the hospital, the two had been wrestling around. They often did this, though it typically didn't last long due to Carver's carpal tunnel. During the course of this wrestling, Carver's gun was accidentally discharged. This charge was also dismissed. District Attorney Locke Bell described both Carver and Cassida as having, quote, a history of quick-temper violence, end quote. Carver's cousin, Michael Poindexter, disagrees with that assessment, saying, quote, Mark has never been a bad young'un. Just like anybody else, you come steal from me, I'm coming to see you. But murder? I can't see it. End quote. Poindexter went on to explain that during the period when police were questioning Carver, he encouraged Carver to hire a lawyer. Poindexter explains that Carver responded, quote, if I get a lawyer, they're going to think I'm automatically guilty when I'm not. End quote. The evidence which had led to the arrest warrants had seemed enough for investigators, but for prosecutors, they felt the case against the two men was still fairly weak. The DNA which had been used to connect Carver and Cassida to the case was touch DNA located at 3 points. Carver's touch DNA had been found on the outside of the car above the rear driver's side door. Cassida's touch DNA had been located in 2 spots inside the vehicle. For the district attorney, this implied that the men had in fact been at the scene that day, but there were details which didn't make any sense. How could the men leave touch DNA at the car, but none on the victim nor any of the ligatures used to commit the murder? One theory was that Carver's DNA was only found on the vehicle because he may have simply been an accomplice, and that following the murder, the men had attempted to push the vehicle into the river. This was odd, considering that the keys were nearby, and pushing the car wouldn't have caused enough of an impact to cause the damage that was sustained. Also, information obtained from the car's black box confirmed someone was in the driver's seat when the impact occurred. In addition to that, how could a man with barely any grip strength and another who was winded simply by walking murder an athletic young woman without leaving behind any signs of a fight? During this time, both Carver and Cassida had been bailed out and were living under house arrest. While Carver felt that he was innocent and that would ultimately be proven in court, Cassida was severely stressed about the situation and felt that they were being framed. When his daughter, Amy, spoke about Cassida's response to the charges, she quoted her father as saying, quote, "They're trying to pin this on me. They were saying that they knew he did it and he just needed to confess it." End quote. Curiously, while investigators had arrested them and the prosecution was weighing their options, DNA samples from 10 other individuals were sent to the state crime lab for testing. This round of DNA testing included that of Christopher Cooper, a Mecklenburg County inmate who wrote a letter to a local reporter claiming responsibility for the crime. His DNA was not a match. For nearly 2 years, there was no movement on the case. Cassida and Carver remained on house arrest, while prosecutors elected not to move forward. Both men were the only suspects in the murder, and for that long duration, police and the district attorney's office worked to bolster their case, but little, if anything, seemed to develop during this time. It was difficult to Ira's family, who felt confused as to why it was taking so long. Charges had been filed, arrests were made, and yet 2 years had passed since Ira had been murdered, and nothing had happened. Finally, in October of 2010, 22 months after Cassida and Carver had been arrested, the district attorney's office finally elected to proceed with trials. They severed the cases, choosing to try both men separately. Jury selection in Cassida's trial was set to take place on Monday, October 11th, 2010. While Cassida was upset about the entire ordeal, his wife Kay has stated that he told her he was looking forward to his day in court and the opportunity to clear his name. Kay and Cassida had met in high school and had been inseparable ever since. They'd raised a family together and had supported each other through the good and the bad. Kay was determined to be there for her husband in court, but she would never get the chance, nor would Cassida have the opportunity to fight for his name. On Sunday, October 10th, Cassida sat at the kitchen table reading a newspaper article about the murder and his upcoming trial. He stood up from the table, explaining that he was going to take a shower. Suddenly, he had trouble breathing and collapsed. Within minutes, Neil Cassida died as a result of a massive heart attack. He was 55 years old. Cassida's family is convinced that the stress of the upcoming trial and the nearly 2 years of accusations and insults hurled in the press and in public had added to his health problems and contributed to his death. The family has expressed their anger and anguish in relation to the case, but have elected not to speak publicly, for the most part, not wanting to possibly cause damage to Carver's case. In response to Cassida's death, the DA moved their attention to focus solely on Carver. Carver couldn't afford an attorney, and so the court appointed Brent Ratchford as legal counsel. Following Cassida's death, Ratchford was granted permission from the court to receive assistance of David Phelps, Cassida's former attorney. When asked about his client's guilt or innocence, Ratchford responded, quote, "There is not an ounce of me that believes that Mark Carver killed her. When you look at the evidence and talk to your client, most of the time, you know where the truth lies." End quote. The prosecution didn't seem too sure of Carver's guilt either. They offered him a deal. Plead guilty to second-degree murder, which carries a sentence of 8 to 14 years in prison, of which Carver was likely to serve only 4 to 8 years, or plead innocence and face the possibility of life. When Ratchford was asked about this, he responded, quote, "I have never gotten such a low offer." He turned it down without batting an eye, end quote. When Carver was asked, he responded, quote, "I'm not going to plead guilty for something I didn't do," end quote. The prosecution moved forward with the case, with DA Locke Bell leading the charge. It was the DA's contention that Carver had murdered Ira with assistance from Cassida. When it came to needing a motive, the DA turned to Ira's camera. The camera had been found in the trunk of her car, with 2 exposures used, though no film present. It was the DA's contention that Ira had seen Carver and Cassida doing something they didn't want known to the public, and so they had murdered Ira in an attempt to cover it up. What it could have been was never discussed, though it was suggested to have possibly been something illegal. For the most part, the DA wasn't providing much of a case. Their evidence was thin, and much of it was speculative. They ultimately believed that Carver and Cassida murdered Ira, and then Cassida fled the scene, and Carver walked a short distance away and continued fishing. The case was presided over by Superior Court Judge Timothy Kincaid, who later said, quote, "The state's case, honestly, it was pretty weak. I suspected they felt like they weren't going to win." End quote. The case, though, took a dramatic turn when Detective William Terry was called to the stand. Terry had been present when SBI agent David Crow had questioned Carver prior to his arrest about the touch DNA evidence as well as about Ira herself. From day one, Carver had denied not only hearing or seeing anything that day, but he denied he'd ever laid eyes on Ira. During questioning by prosecutor Stephanie Hamlin, Terry was asked if Carver described the victim. In order to avoid confusion, I enlisted the assistance of Olivia Lind, one of the hosts of the Something's Not Right podcast. She will read the lines from Prosecutor Hamlin while I read the testimony of Detective Terry.
Did he continue to deny hearing or seeing the victim?
Yes.
But during this interview, didn't Mr. Carver actually describe the victim to you?
Yes, he did.
How did he describe the victim to you?
He said she was, I believe the words he used is, a little thing or a little girl. He described her as being little, and he said that she came up to him right about here.
Because he actually stood up and showed you how far she came up to him?
Yes.
And he indicated actually on his own body where Mrs. Yarmolenko came up to on him?
Yes.
And were those his words?
Then he followed it with, I guess, I've never seen her. Ratchford tried to counter this testimony by asking Detective Terry if Carver specified that he was only guessing, having seen Ira on television. Terry agreed, but at this point the damage was done. This testimony seemed to imply that Carver had in fact seen Ira that day, well enough to describe her height. The jury felt that Carver was caught in a lie, and even Judge Kincaid stated afterward, quote, "As soon as it happened, I thought, they got you," end quote. The other evidence the prosecution relied upon was the DNA, though Judge Kincaid felt that without Detective Terry's testimony, the DNA evidence wouldn't have gotten through to the jury, stating, quote, "A lot of juries, they just don't buy the scientific stuff," end quote. Remember, this was 2010, and while touch DNA has come a long way, it was still relatively new to the scene at the time. The SBI forensic scientist who had made the initial link testified that they found a mixture of different touch DNA on the car, but that which belonged to Carver was 126 million times more likely to belong to him than to belong to any other unrelated Caucasian person in all of North Carolina. The prosecution preemptively brought in experts to counter any argument they felt the defense might make. As for why no DNA was present on Ira or the ligatures, an expert testified that moving water could degrade the sample, hence the Catawba River. Could the DNA have been transferred from Carver to another man, then to the vehicle? A biologist stated that it was unlikely. If Ira had been strangled at the top of the embankment, why was she grasping at weeds near the bottom? The medical examiner, Dr. Wynn, argued that Ira may have regained consciousness at some point if the binding had shifted or been loosened. Following Dr. Wynn's testimony, the prosecution rested. At this point, the jury was dismissed, and Judge Kincaid asked if there were any motions from the defense. Ratchford moved to have the case dismissed, arguing that, while the prosecution had presented evidence showing that Ira had been murdered, they'd failed to prove that Carver was responsible. The prosecution argued back, saying that the DNA put the defendant, quote, in incredibly close proximity, end quote, and that Carver, quote, lied to police in 6 different interviews, end quote. Kincaid took a recess, and upon returning, dismissed the charge of conspiracy, though he upheld the first-degree murder charge, and the trial was ordered to continue. The jury was brought back in, at which point Judge Kincaid asked Ratchford if the defense would be presenting any evidence or witnesses. Ratchford responded, quote, "No, sir, Your Honor, the defense rests," end quote. Carver's attorney presented no evidence and called no witnesses in his client's defense. He didn't challenge the DNA. He didn't argue for other possibilities. The trial would go to closing arguments. Ratchford, when asked about not presenting evidence, stated, quote, "When we made the decision to not call anybody, we thought, wow, this thing is so sketchy, there's no way 12 people are going to be able to go back there and say, we know that he touched that car and killed her." End quote. One major decision Ratchford had to make was whether or not, had they presented a defense, Carver would testify. The fear was that, had they made that choice, Carver may have been confused and easily manipulated on the stand. In his closing argument, Ratchford addressed the thin DNA evidence, as well as making some statements about the possibility of a suicide. To Ratchford and Carver's shock and surprise, at the conclusion of the 6-day-long trial, the jury rendered a guilty verdict after a total of 5 hours of deliberation, spread across 2 days. It's interesting to note that the jury asked during this period, quote, "Are we still to consider acting in concert?" End quote, which implies that, despite no trial or conviction for Cassida, they were debating whether or not Carver acted as an accomplice. Interviewed after the verdict, Ratchford stated, quote, "The jury is wrong, flat out wrong. They put an innocent man in jail today." End quote. Ira's brother Pavel thanked the jury for their service and for giving his family justice. When asked about Carver, Pavel responded, quote, "I don't know what to say. It's hard for us to go on like this, all thanks to you and your cousin." End quote. Carver later stated, quote, "I cried in the holding cell. I just didn't expect them to find me guilty. I was hurt bad. I couldn't believe what was going on." End quote. The following is audio from an interview with Leslie Sellers, a friend of the Carver and Cassida families, as well as audio from Pavel Yarmolenko. Both recordings were taken in the courthouse following the announcement of the verdict. These statements depict the very opposing sides of this argument quite clearly.
Find the right person and instead convict an innocent man. The other man has passed away and there's no respect for that family. His record was expunged. The charges were dropped. This is a travesty of our justice system, or lack of. No DNA on the camera. There was no DNA anywhere except maybe on what they say the trunk. DNA can be transferred. Do people not do their research? Do people not take the time? You know, election season comes up and we need to catch somebody so that somebody can get reelected. And it's not right. And it's not right to put an innocent man in prison for the rest of his life and to destroy the lives of 2 families. Come out of there, the truth did come out, but not all of it.
Justice was done here, and it was so incredible watching all these people put everything they had into this case, and so we're very thankful to everyone for. It was very hard. I don't know. It's been very hard to live through all this, but thank you. I think this is it. Thank you.